Hi there. The NATO summit slated for July 11 and 12 in Brussels will attract more attention than that of last year, not only because of an unpredictable factor, US President Donald Trump, but also because the Western alliance will face another pressure test following their rifts at the recent G7 summit in Canada. Additionally, the scheduled summit between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Finland could put more pitfalls in a complicated geopolitical rivalry. Will the widening schism across the Atlantic Ocean slow? What will be the new focus of the US-led NATO? And what does a more self-independent Europe mean for this planet? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Su Hao from China Foreign Affairs University and Harvey Zoltin, Research Fellow at Center for China and Globalization. We shall also talk to Richard White, Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute, and Victor Olivich, political analyst and lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics via satellite. We shall also be talking to Vox Day, lead editor of Castalia House via Skype. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Do you foresee a serious battle in Brussels between other member states and the United States, the de facto leader of this military bloc?
Well, yeah, there will be the summit of the NATO in Brussels. We know that Brussels is the headquarters of not only the European Union, but also the NATO. Right? So every year there's a summit there amongst the members across the Atlantic. Actually, this is a real military and security alliance in a Western society. Of course, this kind of alliance will have the intention to be, so-called dominance, security dominance over the world. So
the point of my question is, will there be serious disputes? Will there be another G7 where the United States refuses to see eye to eye with their Western allies?
There already is, because Trump went in there and started lecturing the Secretary General of NATO about two things. First, he made this bizarre comment that Germany is totally controlled by Russia, and then he talked about how the NATO members are delinquent. I think that's a good word he used there, because for many years he's been known as an aging juvenile delinquent. And it's already started, and I think it's just going to get worse. Trump is really on a tear. He did several tweets from Air Force One, and he just started on this road.
Obviously, he was imposing maximum pressure on European allies in the hope of increasing their individual military spending to 2% of the GDP. Now let's cross over to Victor, who's standing by in Moscow. Hello, Victor. What do you think of the presidential tweet of Donald Trump that Germany has been totally controlled by Russia?
Well, the European allies of the United States have never been treated this way before by Washington. When the Marshall Plan was instituted in Europe after World War II, when NATO was being formed, of course, it was not just out of generosity, not just a symbol of American generosity, but it was these were programs, these were alliances that were formed to ensure American dominance on the European continent for decades to come. And in exchange, the United States provided its European allies with certain benefits, economic benefits, political benefits, and diplomatic benefits. But what do we see today? Today we see that Washington is starting to treat its European allies almost as adversaries. Despite, this is not just about the demand by the Trump administration for every NATO member to increase its defense spending to 2% of its budget. This is also about the United States withdrawing from the multilateral nuclear deal with Iran, despite serious objections from its European allies, including, by the way, including London. This is about the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Treaty that was negotiated also with the help of the Europeans. This is about the United States making demands now on Germany to stop with its plans to construct a Nord Stream 2 pipeline that would let Germany use Russian gas supplies. And that is very beneficial to
Obviously,
Germany.
we have so many disputes flaring up
between
the United States and the European allies at this moment. Thank you, Victor. Let me come back to the Beijing studio for... I have a question for Professor Su Hao. This NATO summit, do you think will be seriously undermined by the ensuing meeting between Putin and Donald Trump in Helsinki? Because even at the G7 summit back in Canada, Donald Trump threatened to bring Russia back to G7 despite the economic sanctions against Moscow following the annexation of Crimea.
Yes, I'm quite sure that this time, because of this the Russian background, forced Donald Trump would like to have a meeting with him. So this summit of NATO will be something, bring us to a big uncertainty. Of course, in the past, United States as a leading role in the NATO, so they always have their dominance or have their, good positive relation with NATO members over the Atlantic. But now there's the quarrel, not only economic fields, but also the security fields between United States and the NATO members. So make Donald Trump want to somehow to keep the closer relation with Russia. So that kind of special relation.
What's behind the strong intent of President Trump to bring Russia closer to Washington, despite strong opposition from American establishment and his European allies?
Well, this is very curious, Jan Ray, because I believe that there's a lot there that we haven't seen yet in terms of his relationship with Russia. This is being investigated, and many charges have been made. Our very able ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman, listed a lot of these recently, and among them were Russia interfering with America's election, Russia increasing its military presence and preparedness for Central Europe, much more than NATO, etc., etc. But Trump is going on his own merry way. Why? I think the Russians have something on Trump, and we're going to find that out in the future.
Do you believe NATO will perform its duty as it did in the Cold War, despite the disintegration of the former Soviet Union? After years of threat assessment, who is the major rival that may pose a security challenge to the military bloc of NATO?
Well, after the end of the Cold War, we know that NATO already have somehow changeable some function of itself from the military and security implication toward somehow like the political implication. And after the end of the Cold War, some time ago, there was a discussion about how to extend NATO from the Atlantic towards Asia. So that means their target already shifted somehow, not only just focus on the former Soviet Union or Russia, but also prepare something uncertainties with other security issues, particularly some non-traditional security issue. For example, there's the anti-terrorist issue, right? But now, recent years, NATO's regarding functions go back to the traditional format, regarding the rivalry between the big powers, between Russia and the European power, not only in Europe, but also in Middle East. So make the NATO's go back to the traditional format.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Richard, who's standing by in Washington. Hello, Richard. Do you believe...
Hello, good morning. Or good
Hi,
evening.
Richard. Do you think Putin, that is, welcome back to G7, means automatically that the United States will support the annexation of Crimea? Because the economic sanctions that are put in place could be attributed to the Russian takeover of Crimea, and that's something totally unacceptable for the European Union, which argued that you cannot use force to change the border of a traditional nation states. What do you think of this haunting specter, Richard?
Right. I think that President Trump's ability to make these kind of concessions to Putin has significantly decreased during the past years. He's really hemmed in domestically and internationally. So two things he might like to do would be to, for example, repeal the sanctions related to Ukraine. But Congress now has changed the law, so they would have to approve that, and they would not. He could try and get Russia back into the G8, but here he's hemmed in internationally at the level of the allies. The other allies would block that. So he could try and do these things, but he can't. So I think maybe he's just trying to win some favor in Moscow by saying that, look, Russia, you behave well. At some point, you could re-enter the G8. At some point, the sanctions could go away. But I think both Putin and Trump understand that there's nothing that they can do anytime soon, given the strong opposition, which you've mentioned, in the EU and elsewhere, to making concessions to Russia as long as the Ukraine situation remains open.
Richard, I wonder if you agree with me that the proactive efforts by the White House to get close to Russia so quickly means Washington hates to see the very special strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing across the Euro-Asian continent through perhaps the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other very special relationship on the mutual trust between these two major powers. Do you think President Trump wants to separate Moscow or wants Moscow to keep a distance from Beijing so that the geopolitical pressure that Washington faces will be seriously and significantly reduced?
Yeah, that's a great question. People here have been watching the Russia-China relationship move much closer since the end of the Cold War. The Obama administration strategy was pretty much to ignore it. They feared that if it brought attention to this relationship, it would disadvantage the U.S. President Trump, when he was running for election, focused a lot of attention on this issue. He said, look, this is the one reason why we need to move closer to Russia. We've got to pull Russia back away from China, back away from Iran, and bring it closer to the Western powers. And his advisors made that point a lot. But since he's come to office, he's basically dropped this idea, and the U.S. is now very comfortable, as seen in the national security strategies, confronting China and Russia simultaneously, despite the risk of driving them together. There are some people who think they're just natural limits to how close that relationship can be, but there are others who are worried. It's not so much the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that they're worried about. They're more worried about Russian arms sales to China, the joint military exercises, alignment of their approaches in Korea, and so on. I think so. It's a great worry, but it hasn't been something the Trump administration's emphasized in the last year or so.
Thank you very much. Victor, President Trump urges European leaders to take care of their own security matters, and his threat may go as far as to unilaterally withdraw American troops from any major military maneuvers near Europe. Do you think this is a strong possibility? Well, Harvey, what do you think of the chance for President Trump to pull back American troops from their joint military maneuvers with the European allies because of his unhappy attitude towards the lack of military spending by up to 2% of the budget?
I think that there's a substantial chance that he'll do that the same way he appears to think that he made a deal with Kim Jong-un on North Korea, and that he has this ability to do it. Why? Because a year ago, he was listening to his advisors. This time, he's much more self-confident, and he's going by his instincts, which he says are superior to all the advisors. So I worry a great deal, and it's not only what I think, but our American ambassador in Estonia resigned recently because he vehemently disagrees with the Trump policy, and this question goes to the heart of that issue.
Richard, let's take a closer look at the defense spending, which was already on the rise in recent years among the European allies. However, only a few member states lived up to the expectations of the White House. For example, the UK, Greece, and Estonia. Most other European countries still missed the spending target. What does that mean? What do you think will be the worst-case scenario between the United States and its European allies?
Right. There's been a transformation in the balance of European-related defense spending since the last few decades. It used to be half of the spending came from the United States and half came from Europe. And over the decades, this has now fallen to the point where the Europeans maybe pay a quarter, with the U.S. paying 75%. Now, some of that is due to the fact that most of the missions that the U.S. now conducts are outside of Europe, but we use the European bases, for example, to move forces in and out of the Middle East. And so we've been discussing how best to deal with that. For some countries, it's just difficult to make that spending commitment. For others, such as the case of Germany, it's not clear if they doubled their defense budget, what they would spend it on. There's just limited number of troops since they don't have conscription and forces. But it's certainly a sore point for the Trump administration. In particular, President Trump himself seems to make this an issue, and we know he sent out these letters in advance of the summit. So if there's going to be a public fight, it's going to be over this. The allies have been raising defense spending. Some of the ones that do spend high, like Greece, do it for the wrong reasons because they're fearful of another ally, Turkey. So it's not a good measurement, but it's something that NATO is trying to address. And the president's going to make sure to push them along that direction further.
Thank you very much. Victor. Victor, what do you think of the possibility that NATO is likely to fall apart on the issue of military spending? At the same time, Europeans may disagree seriously about who is the enemy of the self-fulfilling prophecy, Russia. Do you think Russia is the most formidable geopolitical rival for member states of NATO in continental Europe with the Brexit?
Well, first, getting back to your question about the reasons for Trump's meeting with Putin in Helsinki on the 16th, of course, despite what one of the guests said about Russia putting pressure on Trump or having some sort of leverage, that couldn't be further from the truth. Trump, from the start, even before he became president, spoke about the need to have good relations with Russia, not because he likes Russia and not because he has a special sympathy for the Russian president, but because he believes it's in the American national interests. Now, why is that? The foreign policy guru for Trump, in a way, for many years was Henry Kissinger. And, of course, it was Kissinger and the then President Richard Nixon who were able to use differences between then Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the late 60s and the early 70s to drive China away even further from the Soviet Union and make Beijing a partner in Washington's Cold War against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Now, today, Trump and some of those close to him and his administration believe, again, that confronting China and Russia and Iran and other geopolitical adversaries at the same time is too costly for the United States, and it's not the most optimal, not the most effective way to resolve this. So Trump is, of course, going to try to wedge Russia away from China, wedge Russia away from its strategic partnership with Beijing. Now, if in the 1990s this could be possible, today it's very unlikely. And it's very unlikely because Russia sees how the West treats it. Russia sees that what happened with NATO expansion. Russia sees that neither the United States nor its most significant European allies are willing to see and treat Russia as an equal partner. And in this situation where Russia really cannot trust its Western partners, it is definitely not going to let itself be wedged away from its strategic partnership with China. So it's very unlikely that we are going to see any significant agreements from this upcoming summit in Helsinki. Now, as far as the future of the NATO alliance, there is an interest on both sides of the Atlantic in keeping NATO intact. In fact, one of the issues that is going to be discussed at the NATO summit is the ascendance of another possible NATO member, former Yugoslav Republic, Macedonia, which is which the Washington is prompting to join NATO as another step of pressuring Russia, showing that American influence in the Balkans is increasing. So despite these differences that we are going to see, growing differences that we are going to see within the NATO alliance that are going to be accentuated by Trump's presence there today, the NATO alliance is going to survive at this point.
Thank you very much. Professor Su, we've been discussing why President Trump is hungry for having a very special relationship with Moscow at a time when the common strategic stakes between Moscow and Beijing is likely or are likely to prevail and overwhelm those between the United States and Moscow. So my point is, are you fully confident that the very special strategic partnership, which is based on mutual trust between Moscow and Beijing, is likely to be crippled and seriously weakened by the proactive diplomacy of the Trump administration to separate Moscow from Beijing?
No, I don't think so. We know that China and Russia will have a very solid foundation for our new mutual relation with each other as the coordinating strategic partnership, because we have our cohesion, regarding us to combine together to face our common interest, like the regional development of the Eurasian continent, like the regional security, in Central Asia, also like the national resilience, between both sides. So we're mutual dependent with each other quite a lot.
What do you mean by national resilience?
National resilience, that means, for example, Russia, regarding economic development recently, not a very good performance, right? China, of course, we're very good performance economically, but also face some challenges that. So that means both sides will have to need more economic, cooperation with each other, so that we can increase our economic developments with each other, right? So this is mutual or, the national resilience between us.
However, some Asian observers have strong doubts about Russia. They say this is a country that cannot be relied upon, that cannot be trusted given its history. It's just a master of international chess. Everything would be at the mercy of its own national interests. So we got to be very careful. Do you think this is reasonable? What do you think of the behavior and trustworthiness of Moscow?
Vis-a-vis the United States, very, very low trustworthiness, because although they deny it, it's clear from all consensus of our intelligence agencies that Russia interfered with our elections, will interfere with our elections in a few months. They're doing other things. They're going around poisoning people, and they're playing a lot of dirty tricks. You have to look at President Putin, who came up through the ranks of the KGB. He's a master of this kind of thing, and I don't trust him personally, and I don't think anybody in our country, except maybe President Trump, trusts him.
You agree with Harvey?
Well, somehow yes. Russia, regarding its internal interference of American politics, right? This is something problem. Even the big challenge to Donald Trump's administration. So the reason why so-called Russian Gate is a big political risk for Donald Trump. But on the other hand, I would say that Donald Trump inherently, he would like to improve American relations with Russia. Not only his personal, so-called personal orientation, would like to keep the special relation with Russia. But on the other hand, because we know that at the end of last year, America's official documents, strategic documents, already set China as the #1 strategic challenger or even competitor. Right? So Russia, even though it's second next to China, right? But if, as you say, that if put some hedge between Russia and China which will be served for Americans' national interest. Of course, it's not very workable for them. But from Donald Trump's intention, he would like to try to keep the special relation with Russia or improve relation with Russia so that to reduce some kind of strategic, dimension which is not favorable towards the United States.
Let me go back to Richard. What do you think of Turkey, which is a member of the NATO but not yet been accepted by European Union? Turkey has helped stem the tidal wave of asylum seeking, assumed a lot of responsibility for doing that. However, we know the differences between Turkey and Washington following the coup attempt of a couple of years ago. So, what do you think of the alleged unpredictability of President Erdogan as a member of the NATO? And this country, by the way, is located uniquely between the European and Asian continent.
Turkey is quite a challenge. You mentioned that one of the Turkish grievances is that they've been kept out of the EU, where a lot of other countries who only decided to enter the EU decades later have basically been able to jump ahead of them in the queue. We discussed why one reason why Greece is meeting its 2% spending is because Greece and Turkey are strong rivals. The relationship between Turkey and various countries in Europe has been disturbed by the Armenian question. Whenever they pass some kind of resolution recognizing the Armenian massacre, the Turkish government pulls its diplomats' complaints. And yet they partner on immigration, on regional security. The same has been true with the US-Turkish relationship. Under Obama, it initially went very well. Turkey was seen as a kind of secular model that the US wanted to see in the Middle East as opposed to Ahmadinejad's Iran. But then the relationship began to sour primarily over Syria. The Turks were upset that the US didn't try and get rid of Assad more strongly. Under Trump, there was a short rebound, but since then the relationship has gone back to being strained. That said, Turkey will not leave NATO, will do everything it can to try and stay in NATO. I mean, it's really uniquely privileged for Turkey to have that kind of NATO connection. It wouldn't be able to join again if it were to leave. And the allies benefit from having a country that lets them use bases for operations in Iraq, Syria, Eastern Mediterranean, and so on, even as Turkey is presenting problems at home, getting in fights with the allies, and sometimes toying with closer relations with Russia.
Harvey, Turkey has a very good relationship with Moscow on the issue of Syria. It cracked down seriously upon the independence movement of Kurds in the Middle East. In many ways, Ankara disagrees with other members of the NATO. What do you think of the future and the membership of Turkey?
I think it's clouded because I think Turkey is already, as it is geographically, halfway between NATO and Russia. And I believe that it's only staying in NATO because of the fact that it gets good intelligence from NATO. It needs this intelligence. And also it's very deficient in air coverage, and they're getting that from NATO. So I think they'll stay in for the future. But in the far future or middle future, I think it's a much more clouded picture.
In the end, we have to go back to the question as to whether NATO will stay together, will stay intact, will survive the current quarrels between Washington and Brussels. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.